All right, welcome. Today, we're going to build your toolkit for analyzing investments like a total pro. We're going to move way beyond just looking at that one simple number, the average return, and really start to uncover the true story of risk and reward that's hiding inside the data.
Okay, let's just jump right in with a classic question. You've got two investment funds, right? And on the surface, they both claim an average return of 8%. So, which one is the better investment? They seem totally identical, don't they? Well, as you're about to see, that one little number barely scratches the surface. The real story is always in the details.
So, here's how we're going to tackle that question. First, we'll talk about finding the data's center. Then, we'll get into taming those extreme returns. After that, we'll measure investment risk. And finally, we'll learn how to compare risk on an apples-to-apples basis. Let's get started.
All right, Section 1, Finding the Data's Center. So, let's start with the absolute basics. You see this number everywhere, right? The so-called average return. Well, in statistics, we have a fancier name for that, a measure of central tendency. And that's going to be our very first clue in this whole investigation. And what is that? Well, it's the good old arithmetic mean. I'm sure you remember this from school. You just add up all the numbers, in our case the returns, and then divide by how many you have. Super simple. And this is always going to be our starting point for trying to figure out how an investment has been doing. Now, let's look at some real numbers. Take a look at this data for what we'll call Fund A. See, for the first 4 years, things are looking pretty steady, kind of just cruising along. But then, damn, look at year 5, a massive 56% return. Now that, my friends, is what we call an outlier, and it is about to cause a whole lot of trouble for our analysis. And here's exactly where that problem shows up. That one incredible year literally dragged the average, the arithmetic mean, all the way up to 18%. But look at the median, the actual middle value if you line them all up, it's only 9%. So which one of those numbers really feels like a typical year for this fund? Yeah, I think we can both agree on the answer to that.
And this is the whole point right here. The median is super resistant to those crazy outliers, while the mean gets pulled all over the place by them. So the big takeaway for you is this. The median often gives you a much more honest picture of what's really going on, one that isn't totally skewed by 1 or 2 wild years. So from now on, when you see an average return being advertised, be a little skeptical. You got to ask yourself, is it possible that a few extreme numbers are making this look better than it really is?
Okay, Section 2, Taming Extreme Returns. So we know outliers are a problem. The big question now is, what do we actually do about them? Let's take a look at how we can handle these wild numbers in a more systematic way. You see, instead of just focusing on that one single point in the dead center, we can use something called measures of location, like quartiles, to break up our data into 4 equal chunks. This gives us a much better map of the entire landscape of returns, everything from the absolute minimum to the maximum. It shows us where the action is really happening. And when you lay it all out like this, that huge 56% return just jumps right off the page. It becomes so obvious. And once we've spotted it, we have to make a decision.
So what's an analyst to do? Well, you've got a few options. Option 1, do nothing. If that 56% return is a legit part of the investment story, you leave it in. Option 2, you could just delete it. Maybe it was a total fluke, a once-in-a-lifetime thing, so you use a trimmed mean to get a better sense of a normal year. Or option 3, you could replace it with a less extreme value, something called a Winsorized mean. The right choice really depends on the story behind that number. Was it a mistake, a one-off event, or is that kind of volatility just the nature of this particular beast? It's all about context.
All right, moving on to Section 3, Measuring Investment Risk. So we figured out how to find the center, and we know what to do with the extremes. Now for the really fun part. We're going to measure the wobble. And this wobble around the average is exactly how we start to put a real number on the concept of investment risk. This quote from the CFA Institute really nails it. Dispersion is the variability around the central tendency. Dispersion is just a fancy way of saying how spread out all the data points are. So, if the mean return is all about the reward, then dispersion is all about the risk. And this is so important because you can have 2 funds with the exact same average return, but one could be a nice smooth ride and the other could be, well, a much, much bumpier one.
So how do we measure this wobble? Well, our number one tool is something called standard deviation. Now I know, when you see a bunch of steps like this, it can look a little intimidating, but trust me, the idea behind it is actually pretty simple.
All we're really doing is figuring out, on average, how far each year's return is from the mean. We square those distances just to make everything positive and, kind of cleverly, to give more weight to the really big swings. Then we average those squared distances out. That gets us something called the sample variance. And the very last step is to just take the square root of that, which gets us back to a percentage we can easily understand. It's a whole process, I know, but it boils down to one single super powerful number.
And for our fun day, after we crunch all those numbers, we get a standard deviation of 21.9%. And just like that, we have a single number that quantifies the fund's volatility. It's simple. The higher this number, the riskier that ride has been.
And here we go, Section 4, Comparing Apples to Apples Risk. This is the grand finale, folks. This is the tool that's going to bring everything we've learned together and finally, let us answer that question we started with. Which fund is actually better?
But let's stop for a second and ask a really important question. Is all volatility bad? I mean, think about it. Nobody ever complains when their investment unexpectedly shoots up, right? What we as investors really, truly care about is downside risk, the danger of our returns falling below some target. And you should know there are specific measures, like downside deviation, that focus only on that negative volatility.
And that leads us to our ultimate tool, the coefficient of variation, or CV for short. Honestly, this thing is a total game changer. It's the key to making a true apples-to-apples comparison. And it's so beautifully simple. It's just a ratio. You take the risk, that's our standard deviation, and you divide it by the reward, that's our mean return. What it tells you is just brilliant. It tells you exactly how much risk you're taking on for every 1% of return you expect to get.
So let's put this into practice. Check out this table. We've got a stock fund and a bond fund. The stock fund has a much higher mean return, right? 15% versus 8%, but it also has way more risk. Look at that standard deviation, it's double. Now, if we just stop there, it'd be a tough call, but look what happens when we calculate the CV. The bond fund CV is actually lower. That tells us that the bond fund is more efficient. It gives you a better bang for your risk buck, so to speak. You're taking on less risk for each % of return you're hoping to get. And that's the bottom line. The lower the coefficient of variation, the better the risk-adjusted return. It's really that simple. Think about where we started. We went from looking at one single, potentially misleading number, the average, to having this incredibly powerful tool that helps us make much, much smarter decisions.
So, what's the big takeaway here? The next time you see some investment advertising a big, flashy average return, you'll know better, won't you? You'll know to ask what's really hiding behind that number. You're going to dig deeper, question that average, and measure the risk. Because now you've got the tools to see the whole story.